Hello everyone, welcome to our presentation. In this project, we analyze the Brazilian economy. Brazil is the largest economy in South America, and in many ways, its economic structure reminds us of Turkey. It has strong potential, but at the same time, it faces recurring financial challenges.
Where both the government and private firms play important roles. It is strong in agriculture, mining, and export like coffee, beef, and soybeans. But it also faces challenges such as inflation, high public debt, and income inequality.
Our main goal is to understand Brazil's recent economic performance by using two perspectives. From a macroeconomic point of view, we look at the growth, inflation, unemployment, and policy decisions. From a microeconomic perspective, we focus on the automotive industry and analyze how firms behave in the market. By combining these two views, we aim better than understand Brazil's economic challenges and future prospects.
GDP growth. When we look at the GDP graph, we see that Brazil grows strongly in recent years, with 3.2% growth in 2023 and 3.4% in 2024. In 2025, growth slows to around 2.2%, which looks like a normal cooling after a strong period. This growth mainly comes from domestic consumption, meaning people are spending more. We also see investments increasing, especially in machinery and equipment, which passed 17%.
Now let's look at inflation. According to the inflation graph, by November 2025, inflation fell to 4.46%. Food and transportation prices become more stable. However, housing, healthcare, and education are still expensive. So inflation is going down overall, but people still feel pressure in daily life.
The unemployment graph shows one of the most positive trends. Unemployment dropped to 5.6%, the lowest level since 2012. Also, more than 59% of jobs are formal, which means more stable and secure employment.
Now let's move to the exchange rate. The exchange rate graph shows the Brazilian real staying around 5.40 per US dollar. This stability is closely linked to monetary policy.
One of the fiscal side, the government became much more careful after the large pandemic defeat in 2020. Public spending was controlled and fiscal discipline became a priority in order to stabilize public finance and prevent debt from rising further. As a result, the budget balance improved over time. However, this also means that spending on infrastructure and social programs become more limited.
Monetary policy has been very tight in recent years. The central bank kept interest rates very high, at 15%, mainly to reduce inflation and support the exchange rates. Even though credit continued to grow in 2024, the graph shows that credit growth started to slow in 2025, which means monetary policy is now having its intended effects.
If we look at the budget balance graph, we see that the gap between government spending and revenue is slowly getting smaller. This shows that Brazil is recovering from the pandemic shock in fiscal term.
However, the public debt graph is still worrying. Brazil spends about 5.6% of GDP just on interest payments. This limits how much money the government can spend on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Public debt remains the biggest long-term challenge.
Looking at the trade balance graph, Brazil still has a trade surplus of around $5.84 billion. Agriculture and manufacturing are the main drivers here.
The competitiveness index shows improvement for the second year in a row. This means Brazil is moving in the right direction, even though it's not yet among the top global economies.
In this chapter, I will talk about the Brazilian passenger car industry from a macroeconomic point of view. Brazil is the largest automotive market in South America and one of the important car producers in the world. The most important feature of this industry is that it requires very high capital and advanced technology. Because of this, it is not easy for small companies to enter the market. Brazil has a large population of about 212 million people, which increases the demand for cars. For many years, the government has used to hike important tax and trade restriction to encourage companies to produce car inside the country. As a result, local production has grown and the industry has reached a very large economic size. After giving a general overview of the industry, I will now talk about the recent developments and production problems. In recent years, the industry faced serious problems. In 2020, car production fell sharply because of the COVID-19 pandemic. After that, the global chip shortage slowed down the recovery until 2022. Although production started to increase again in 2023 and 2024, it is still below pre-pandemic levels. One important reason for this is high interest rates, which reduced consumer demand. To understand these problems better, we need to look at the market structure and entry barriers. When we look at the market structure, we can see the Brazilian passenger car market has an oligopolistic structure. This means that the market is controlled by a small number of large firms. Stellantis, Volkswagen, General Motors, and Toyota together control about 68% of the market. One of the biggest entry barriers in this industry is high sunk costs. New firms must invest billions of dollars in factories, machines, and research development. For example, companies like BYD and Great Wall Motors have announced very large investment plans. Government policies also increase entry barriers. Brazil applies import taxes of up to 35% on cars coming from outside the Mercosur region. In addition, tax advantages for electric and hybrid vehicles have been removed. In conclusion, the Brazilian passenger car industry has an oligopolistic market structure because of high market concentration, high investment cost, and strong government protection. These factors make competition limited and market entry very difficult for new firms.
First, I will define the market and the scope of my analysis. The presentation focuses on the Brazilian automotive market from a microeconomic perspective. I analyze the interaction between consumers and firms, especially demand conditions, production costs, and indirect taxes. The automotive sector is a good example because it is highly dependent on the credit and very sensitive to the interest rates. Now I will explain the market mechanism. On the demand side, high interest rates increase loan costs and reduce car purchases. On the supply side, depreciation of the Brazilian real and indirect taxes increase production costs. This shifts the supply curve upward. When demand decreases and cost increase at the same time, prices rise and the equilibrium quantity falls. This outcome matches standard microeconomic theory and explains recent developments in the Brazilian automotive market.
In recent years, car prices in Brazil have increased mainly because of inflation and the depreciation of the Brazilian real. Since many car parts are imported, higher costs quickly increase final car prices. As a result, buying a new car has become more difficult, especially for middle-class families. Higher prices reduce consumer surplus, which means consumers' welfare decreases. Low and middle-income consumers are affected the most, while high-income consumers are less affected. The automotive sector also creates negative externalities. In large cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, heavy car use increases air pollution. Traffic congestion leads to time loss and higher fuel consumption. These costs are not reflected in market prices, so they create a loss of social welfare. To deal with these problems, Brazil has a program called Rota 2030. The government wants to reduce environmental problems and supports cleaner cars, so electric vehicles receive some tax support. However, electric cars are still very expensive. Many people cannot afford them. especially low-income consumers. In my opinion, government intervention is necessary, but the results are still weak and do not benefit everyone equal.
Brazil's tight monetary policy has been effective in reducing inflation, but it also has a downside. High interest rates make car loans more expensive, which lowers demand and slows sales. On the supply side, a weaker currency and high indirect taxes increase production costs, pushing car price up.
While banks and large firms benefit from higher interest income, consumers and car producers face higher costs and lower sales. This creates fairness concerns, as taxes and high prices hurt middle and low income households the most.
Based on the graphs, we have some short recommendations. First of all, Brazil should focus on reducing public debts because spending so much money on interest really limits investment in education and healthcare. Secondly, short vocational training programs would be very useful for young people. Since many of them are not studying or working, this could help them enter the formal job market faster.
Thirdly, simplifying the tax system would make it easier for small businesses to grow, which is important for long-term competitiveness. Finally, Brazil should improve roads and ports. Even with a trade surplus, high logistic costs reduce efficiency, so better infrastructure would strongly support exporters.
Brazil's automotive market is shaped by both the economy and market structure, while growth, inflation, and employment are relatively stable. High interest rates still reduce car demand. At the same time, a few large firms dominate the market, and strong entry barriers keep prices high. This shows that both economic policy and market competition are needed for the sector to grow. Thank you for listening.